A single sentence can end a marriage faster than a slammed door. The laughter started small. A soft ripple across the polished dining room like a pebble dropped into a still lake. Crystal glasses trembled faintly under the chandelier light. Someone coughed into their napkin. Someone else looked away. But the word had already landed. Claire Whitmore leaned back in her chair, one hand wrapped loosely around a champagne flute, the pale gold liquid catching the glow of the room's expensive lighting. Her colleagues from Whitmore Financial sat around the long oak table, suits pressed sharp, smiles practiced and polite. It was supposed to be a celebration. A Friday night dinner after the company closed its biggest deal of the year. And Claire was the center of it all. 32 years old. Founder. CEO. The youngest executive in the room, and already the one everyone was trying to impress. She had built the company from a borrowed laptop in a tiny apartment in Chicago. Now investors flew across the country just to shake her hand. Success had a sound. Tonight it was the soft clink of glass and the quiet hum of people trying to stay close to power. Marcus Reed noticed it the moment he walked in. Not the luxury. He had never cared about that. It was the way the room shifted when Claire spoke. The way people leaned toward her words like plants toward sunlight. Marcus stood near the end of the table, broad shoulders relaxed inside a simple charcoal jacket that looked out of place among the custom-tailored suits. He wasn't uncomfortable, just observant. A mechanic learns that early. Engines talk if you listen carefully enough. Rooms do too. And this one was saying something loud, even in silence. Claire had already told the story twice tonight. The story of how she closed the deal. How she outmaneuvered a rival firm. How she convinced investors who once dismissed her. Each retelling grew sharper, brighter, a little more dramatic. Her coworkers loved it. They applauded again when she finished. But then someone made the mistake of asking the question that turned the night sideways. So Marcus, a man in a navy suit, said with a friendly grin that wasn't quite friendly, "What do you do again?" The room tilted slightly in that subtle way people don't notice unless they've lived outside rooms like this their whole life. Marcus didn't rush his answer. "I run an auto shop over on Maple Street," he said calmly. "Mostly engines. Sometimes transmissions." A pause. The kind that sits awkwardly between two worlds. Someone gave a polite nod. Someone else forced a smile. The man in the navy suit chuckled softly, as if trying to help. "Well, every empire needs someone to keep the cars running." A few people laughed. Quiet. Controlled. Harmless on the surface. Claire lifted her glass again. The champagne had gone warm, but she didn't seem to notice. Maybe it was the long week. Maybe it was the pressure of being watched by people who expected her to prove she belonged in their world. Or maybe it was the alcohol loosening the part of her pride she usually kept hidden. She tilted her head toward Marcus, half smiling, and said the sentence that would echo long after the room went silent. "Sometimes I feel like I married a monkey." The word slipped out like it belonged there, like it had been waiting behind her teeth all evening. For a second nobody moved. Even the air seemed to freeze under the chandelier. A few people laughed again, but softer now. Nervous. Testing whether it was safe to laugh at all. Marcus didn't react the way people expected. No raised voice. No anger. No slammed chair. He simply looked at her. Really looked. The way someone does when they're memorizing the final page of a book they once loved. His eyes were steady. Not hurt. Not furious. Just quiet in a way that made the laughter fade on its own. Then he set his napkin on the table beside his untouched plate and stood up slowly. "I hope one day," Marcus said gently, his voice calm enough to carry across the entire room, "you remember who stood beside you before the world did." No one answered. Marcus turned toward the door. And just like that, the celebration kept going. But something important had already left the room. The door closed behind Marcus Reed with a soft click that no one inside the restaurant seemed to notice at first. Conversations slowly returned, cautious at the beginning, like people testing whether the ground was still stable beneath their feet. A fork touched a plate. Someone cleared their throat. Claire Whitmore lifted her glass again as if nothing important had just happened, but the champagne did not taste the same anymore. Across the street the night air felt cooler than Marcus expected. Chicago in early October had that quiet edge to it, the kind that made people pull their coats tighter as they hurried toward warm apartments and familiar lights. Marcus did not hurry. He stepped onto the sidewalk and stood still for a moment, hands resting in his jacket pockets, watching the traffic move past the restaurant windows. Yellow taxi lights slid across the glass like slow comets. Inside that glowing room, Claire was already turning back toward her colleagues, toward the world that had slowly grown louder than the one they once shared. Marcus breathed in the cold air and let it settle in his chest. He had learned something important about pain a long time ago. The loudest moments were rarely the ones that changed your life. It was the quiet ones that did the real work. The moments where a man simply understood something that could never be undone. 3 miles away, a small apartment building stood between a laundromat and a grocery store that stayed open 24 hours a day. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. When Marcus unlocked the door to apartment 3B, the first thing he saw was the glow of a small lamp beside the couch and the shape of a young boy curled beneath a blanket patterned with faded blue rockets. Marcus stepped inside carefully and closed the door without making a sound. 8-year-old Elijah Reed had fallen asleep with a science magazine open on his chest, one small hand still resting on the page, as if he had been reading until the moment his eyes gave up. Marcus walked over and gently lifted the magazine away. The boy stirred slightly. "Dad," Elijah murmured without opening his eyes. Marcus smiled softly. "I'm right here, kid." The boy relaxed immediately, the way children do when they know the person they trust most in the world is close. Marcus pulled the blanket higher around Elijah's shoulders and sat quietly on the edge of the couch. The apartment was simple but warm. A small kitchen table near the window. Crayon drawings taped neatly to the refrigerator. A shelf filled with toy cars that Elijah insisted on lining up by color every night before bed. None of it looked like the world Claire Whitmore had just celebrated in that restaurant downtown. But Marcus had never believed success needed polished floors or expensive lighting. Sometimes success looked like a child sleeping peacefully in a room that felt safe. Marcus reached for the framed photograph sitting on the side table. It was taken 6 years earlier in a public park near Lake Michigan. Claire stood in the center of the picture with sunlight in her hair, her smile wide and unguarded. Marcus stood beside her holding a much smaller Elijah on his shoulders while the boy laughed at something outside the camera frame. For a long moment Marcus studied that photograph as if it belonged to someone else's life. Then he placed it gently back on the table and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. The silence in the apartment was steady, honest. Not like the silence in that restaurant where people waited to see who would speak first. Marcus did not need to ask himself what came next. Some men leave because they are angry. Some leave because they feel defeated. Marcus Reed simply understood that a door had closed and that no amount of standing in the hallway would open it again. And somewhere deep inside him another quiet thought began to form, one that would take years to fully understand. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is walk away without teaching the world how much it hurt. Morning arrived quietly in apartment 3B, the pale Chicago sunlight slipping through the narrow blinds and drawing long stripes across the living room floor. Marcus Reed was already awake before the alarm clock reached 6:30. Years of early mornings had trained his body to rise before the city began its noise. The coffee maker hummed softly in the kitchen while the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the small apartment. Marcus stood at the counter, stirring a spoon slowly through a plain ceramic mug, watching the steam rise in thin curls. The apartment was peaceful in that early hour. No traffic yet. No televisions through the walls. Just the distant rumble of a train moving somewhere far across the city. Behind him, Elijah shifted under the blanket on the couch and opened his eyes slowly. Children have a way of sensing when something has changed, even when nobody explains it out loud. Elijah rubbed his eyes and looked toward the kitchen. "Did you get home late, Dad?" Marcus turned with the same calm expression he always carried, the kind that never told the whole story. "A little late," he said gently. "Big night for your mom's company." Elijah sat up, swinging his feet over the edge of the couch. "Did they celebrate?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes, they did." The boy studied his father for a moment the way children do when they are trying to understand something adults think they are hiding. But Elijah was only 8 years old, and the world still felt mostly simple. Pancakes on Saturday morning. School buses. Science magazines about rockets and planets. He climbed down from the couch and walked toward the kitchen, wrapping his arms around Marcus's waist in a sleepy hug. Marcus rested one hand on the back of his son's head and closed his eyes for just a second. In that quiet kitchen, the noise of the restaurant from the night before felt very far away. "Are you taking me to school today?" Elijah asked. "Of course," Marcus answered. Like every day. The boy nodded with quiet satisfaction and sat at the small table while Marcus placed 2 plates of toast beside a bowl of scrambled eggs. It was not a fancy breakfast, but it was warm and steady, and that had always mattered more. Outside the window, the first rush of morning traffic began to move through the streets below. Marcus sat across from Elijah and watched the boy carefully spreading peanut butter across his toast with complete focus. It was such a small moment that most people would have missed it. But Marcus had learned that life was built from moments exactly like this one. Elijah looked up suddenly. "Are we seeing Mom this weekend?" The question floated across the table with the simple honesty only a child could have. Marcus did not answer immediately. He took a slow sip of coffee and set the mug back down. "Not this weekend," he said calmly. "She is very busy right now." Elijah nodded again, accepting the answer without protest. Children believe adults know what they are doing. That belief is one of the most fragile things in the world. After breakfast, Marcus helped Elijah pack his school bag. The boy slipped his science magazine inside beside his math homework and a small plastic rocket he insisted on carrying everywhere. When they stepped out into the cool morning air, the city had fully awakened. Car horns echoed through the street, and people hurried past with travel mugs in their hands. Marcus locked the apartment door and placed one hand on Elijah's shoulder as they walked toward the old pickup truck parked along the curb. The truck had a dent on the passenger side and more miles on the engine than Marcus liked to admit, but it started every morning without complaint. Marcus started the engine and glanced once in the rearview mirror as Elijah buckled his seatbelt. Somewhere downtown, Claire Whitmore was probably already stepping into another glass office tower, preparing for another day of meetings and investors and applause. But Marcus did not think about that world now, because the road ahead of him was quiet, and for the first time in a long time he understood something clearly. Some chapters in life do not end with shouting or arguments. They end with a man driving his son to school on a cool Chicago morning while the rest of the world continues forward without noticing what was lost. Time has a quiet way of revealing truths that pride once hid. 3 years passed across the city of Chicago the way seasons always do, one after another, winter folding into spring, spring drifting towards summer, and summer eventually cooling into another long autumn. The streets changed in small ways. New cafes opened where old stores once stood. Glass towers rose higher against the skyline. And Whitmore Financial became a name that appeared regularly on national business channels. Claire Whitmore moved through that world with the calm precision of someone who had mastered it. Her office now occupied the 42nd floor of a steel and glass building overlooking the Chicago River. From her window, the city looked orderly and obedient, lines of traffic flowing beneath her like streams of light. Her mornings began the same way almost every day. Assistants arriving with reports. Investors waiting in the conference room. A schedule that rarely left a free minute between sunrise and sunset. Success surrounded her now in ways that once felt impossible. The company she built had grown into an empire of analysts, consultants, and international clients who trusted her judgment with millions of dollars at a time. People stood when she entered a room. They listened carefully when she spoke. Some even admired her with the kind of careful distance reserved for powerful figures. Yet admiration has a strange quality. It fills the room, but never quite fills the silence inside it. One afternoon, Claire sat alone in the conference room after a long meeting had ended. The polished table reflected the city lights beginning to glow outside as dusk settled over Chicago. She flipped through a stack of contracts without really reading them. Numbers blurred into each other. Words lost their shape. Across the empty room, a television screen played a muted financial broadcast showing market updates and corporate announcements. A reporter spoke about Whitmore Financial expanding into 2 new states. Claire watched her own name appear beneath the headline and felt something unexpected. Not pride, not excitement, just a quiet distance. The assistant who usually stayed late knocked gently on the door. "Your car is ready downstairs," she said. Claire nodded without looking up. "Thank you." When the assistant left, the room returned to silence again. The kind of silence that large offices often carry after everyone has gone home. Claire closed the folder in front of her and leaned back in the chair. For a moment, her eyes drifted toward the dark window, reflecting her own image against the night skyline. It had been 3 years since that dinner. 3 years since the room filled with laughter that suddenly stopped. At first she believed Marcus would call. People always came back eventually. That was the pattern she had seen her entire career. Apologies. Negotiations. Second chances arranged neatly over coffee. But Marcus Reed never called. Weeks turned into months. Months folded quietly into years. The world continued forward with remarkable efficiency. Whitmore Financial grew. Investors praised her discipline. The newspapers printed photographs of her standing beside other successful executives. Yet sometimes late at night, when the office finally emptied and the city lights flickered across the glass windows, Claire found herself remembering smaller things instead. The way Marcus used to fix the kitchen faucet without complaining when it started leaking again. The quiet way he listened when she talked through complicated ideas late at night during the early days of the company. The steady patience in his voice when Elijah asked endless questions about how engines worked. None of those memories appeared in her business reports or investment briefings. They simply existed somewhere beneath the surface of a life that had grown louder with success, but somehow less certain in its quietest moments. Claire stood slowly and gathered her coat from the back of the chair. The elevator ride down 42 floors felt longer than usual. Outside the building, the driver opened the car door while the evening traffic crawled through downtown streets glowing with neon and headlights. Claire stepped inside and watched the city pass by through the window. Somewhere across that vast stretch of buildings and neighborhoods, Marcus Reed was living a life she knew nothing about anymore. And for the first time in a long while, a thought appeared that she could not easily push away. Sometimes the greatest distance between two people is not measured in miles, but in the silence that follows the words you can never take back. Saturday mornings in Chicago have a rhythm that feels slower than the rest of the week. Traffic moves softer. Coffee shops fill with quiet conversations instead of rushed phone calls. And in a small community center on the west side of the city, the sound of children laughing echoed across a gymnasium floor that once sat empty most weekends. Marcus Reed stood near a folding table covered with tools and small mechanical parts while a group of children gathered around him with wide, curious eyes. In Marcus's hands was a simple bicycle chain that had slipped off its gears. The boy who owned the bicycle stood beside him watching carefully. "Machines talk," Marcus said calmly while guiding the chain back into place. "You just have to listen to what they are trying to tell you." The boy nodded as if that made perfect sense. A few other children leaned closer. For the last 2 years, the center had slowly grown into a place where neighborhood kids could come after school or on weekends to learn practical skills. Some days they worked on bicycles. Other days they built small wooden shelves or repaired old radios donated by local families. It was not a large program. There were no television cameras or business headlines celebrating it. But the room carried a steady energy that did not need applause to feel important. Elijah Reed moved through the gym carrying a clipboard that looked far too serious for a 12-year-old boy. His job that morning was writing down the names of new kids who wanted to join the workshop group. Every few minutes he glanced toward his father with the quiet pride children have when they believe their parents are doing something meaningful. Marcus finished adjusting the bicycle chain and handed the tool back to the boy. "Try it now." The boy pushed the pedals slowly. The chain caught smoothly, and the back wheel spun without hesitation. A smile spread across his face like sunlight breaking through clouds. "It works," he shouted. The other children laughed and clapped lightly. Marcus stepped back and folded his arms with a small, satisfied nod. Moments like that had become familiar now. Small victories that arrived quietly, but stayed longer than most people expected. Later that afternoon, a local volunteer walked across the gym carrying a stack of flyers. "The city charity event confirmed the guest list," she said while handing Marcus a printed page. "A lot of sponsors are attending this year." Marcus glanced down at the list without much interest at first. Names of companies. Local donors, business organizations supporting community programs. But halfway down the page his eyes paused on a name he had not seen in years. Whitmore Financial. For a moment Marcus simply studied the paper in his hands. The gymnasium around him continued with its usual noise. Children laughing. Tools tapping against wooden tables. The steady hum of a place where people were building things together. Elijah noticed the stillness in his father's expression and walked closer. "Everything okay?" he asked. Marcus looked up and the calm returned to his face just as quickly as it had disappeared. "Everything is fine," he said gently before folding the paper and setting it aside. Some chapters in life return when you least expect them. Not loudly, not with warning, Just a quiet name on a sheet of paper reminding you that the past is never as far away as it once seemed. And somewhere across the city, another calendar was slowly moving toward the same charity event where two lives that once stood side by side were about to cross paths again. The evening of the charity event arrived with the quiet elegance that Chicago reserved for its most polished gatherings. The ballroom overlooked the river, its tall glass windows reflecting the glow of city lights stretching across the skyline like scattered stars. Soft music floated through the air while guests moved between. Round tables dressed in white linen and silver centerpieces. Conversations rose and fell in polite waves as investors, business leaders, and community organizers gathered for the annual fundraiser. For Claire Whitmore, the evening followed a familiar rhythm. Cameras flashed near the entrance as she stepped inside, her presence recognized almost immediately by several sponsors who approached with practiced smiles and firm handshakes. Her reputation had grown far beyond the city during the last 3 years. Whitmore Financial was now expanding into national markets, and every appearance she made carried the quiet attention reserved for people who shaped industries. Claire moved through the room with composed confidence, answering questions, exchanging greetings, and offering polite remarks about the importance of supporting youth programs across Chicago. Yet beneath that smooth exterior there was a subtle distraction that evening she could not quite explain. Perhaps it was the unusual location of the event or the way the room carried a different kind of energy than the corporate gatherings she normally attended. This crowd was not built on contracts and negotiations. It was built on people who believed small changes could reshape entire communities. Across the ballroom, a large display board showed photographs of the programs the charity supported. Children building bicycles, teenagers repairing old computers, volunteers teaching practical skills to kids who rarely had access to workshops or training programs. Claire paused briefly in front of the display as a volunteer explained the organization's mission. "One of our most successful programs started just 2 years ago," the volunteer said with visible pride. "A mechanical workshop for kids on the west side. It began with only 6 students. Now we have more than 50. Claire nodded politely while glancing at the photographs. One picture in particular caught her attention. A group of children gathered around a tall man standing beside a wooden workbench. The man was holding a bicycle tire while explaining something to the group. His expression was calm, focused. The children watched him with complete trust. Claire felt a strange pull of recognition before she even realized why. At the far end of the ballroom, the host of the evening stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight." He began as the conversations gradually softened. "Before dinner, we would like to recognize someone whose work has transformed one of our most important community programs." Applause rose lightly across the room. Claire turned toward the stage with the rest of the guests as the host continued speaking. 2 years ago, this program began with one man volunteering his time to teach basic mechanical skills to neighborhood kids. What started as a small workshop has now become one of the most successful youth initiatives in the city. The host paused with a warm smile. "Please welcome the founder of the program, Marcus Reed." The name moved through the room quietly but powerfully. Claire felt the air shift around her, as if the entire ballroom had suddenly grown still. Her eyes lifted toward the stage just as a tall figure stepped into the light beside the microphone. Marcus Reed looked older now, the calm strength in his posture even more settled than she remembered. The room greeted him with sincere applause, but Marcus only offered a modest nod before speaking. "Good evening, everyone," he said gently. "I am grateful for the chance to help kids discover what they are capable of building with their own hands." His voice carried across the room with the same steady warmth she had heard years ago in quieter places far from boardrooms and investors. Claire stood frozen among the guests, the sound of applause echoing around her as a realization slowly settled into place. For 3 years, she had wondered what kind of life Marcus had built after walking away. Now the answer stood clearly in front of her beneath the soft lights of a ballroom, filled with strangers who respected him for reasons that had nothing to do with wealth or status. For a moment, Claire Whitmore could not hear the applause around her. The ballroom lights seemed softer, the conversations fading into a distant blur, while her eyes remained fixed on the man standing calmly at the podium. Marcus Reed had not changed in the ways she once expected people to change. He was still tall, still steady in the quiet way he carried himself. But there was something different now in the way the room responded to him. It was not the kind of attention Claire understood from boardrooms or business conferences. This was respect that came from something deeper. The host stepped aside while Marcus spoke for only a few minutes. He did not talk about success or personal achievements. Instead, he spoke about the children in the program, about how curiosity grows when someone finally believes their hands can build something meaningful. His words were simple and direct. No dramatic pauses. No polished corporate language. Yet the entire ballroom listened carefully. When he finished, the applause rose again, louder than before, not because he had asked for it, but because the people in that room felt they had witnessed something honest. Marcus nodded politely and stepped down from the stage as volunteers guided him toward the tables near the front of the room. Claire remained where she stood, her mind moving through memories she had not visited in years. She remembered the early days of Whitmore Financial when the company existed only as an idea on a laptop screen. She remembered the long nights where Marcus listened patiently while she explained complicated plans about markets and investments that had not yet become real. He never interrupted. He simply listened and asked thoughtful questions that helped her see the problems more clearly. At the time, she believed that quiet support would always be there waiting whenever she returned home from another exhausting day. But somewhere between ambition and recognition, she stopped noticing the person who had been standing beside her all along. A voice beside her broke the stillness. One of the charity board members smiled politely. "You know Marcus Reed?" he asked after noticing the direction of her gaze. Claire hesitated before answering. "We knew each other a long time ago." The board member nodded with admiration. "He is an impressive man. This program would not exist without him. When he started volunteering here, the building barely had enough tools to run a workshop. Now we have partnerships with several schools across the city." Claire glanced again toward the front tables where Marcus was speaking with a group of volunteers and local donors. His posture remained relaxed, his expression calm as he listened to the people around him. There was no sign of arrogance in the way he carried himself. No need to prove anything to the room. The board member continued speaking with quiet enthusiasm. "He never asked for recognition either. We had to convince him to come tonight. He says the program belongs to the kids, not to him." Claire felt something tighten quietly in her chest as those words settled into her thoughts. Across the ballroom, Marcus laughed gently at something. One of the volunteers said and shook hands with a young student who had clearly come to support him that evening. The boy looked up at Marcus with the kind of admiration children reserve for people they trust completely. Claire watched that moment longer than she expected, because somewhere deep inside her a realization was forming that she could no longer ignore. For years, she had measured value through profit, influence, and the way people responded when she entered a room. Yet the respect surrounding Marcus Reed had grown from something entirely different. It came from patience, from quiet consistency, from a life built one meaningful action at a time. And standing there among strangers who admired the man she once thought she fully understood, Claire Whitmore finally began to see the truth that had been hidden behind her own ambition. The man she believed she had outgrown had simply chosen a different path, one that had quietly turned him into someone the world respected in ways money alone could never create. The music in the ballroom had shifted into a softer melody by the time dinner ended, and guests slowly began drifting toward smaller conversations scattered across the room. Glasses clinked quietly while the river lights shimmered through the tall windows behind them. Claire Whitmore remained near the edge of the ballroom for several minutes, watching the crowd move around the man she had once known better than anyone else. Marcus Reed stood near one of the round tables speaking with a group of volunteers and donors who seemed genuinely eager to hear what he had to say. Every now and then someone laughed at a quiet remark he made. He listened more than he spoke, the same way he always had. The difference now was that the room listened back. Claire finally took a slow breath and stepped away from the wall. Each step toward him felt strangely deliberate, as if the distance across the ballroom carried more weight than the miles that had separated their lives for the past 3 years. When she reached the table, the volunteers were just beginning to move toward the dessert station across the room. Marcus turned slightly and saw her standing there. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Time has a way of folding when two people who once shared a life meet again after years apart. Marcus was the first to offer a small, polite smile. "Claire," he said simply, Hearing her name spoken in his voice again felt different than she remembered. Calm, familiar, but no longer belonging to the same world she lived in. Claire nodded slowly. Marcus. The quiet between them stretched for a moment before she finally spoke again. I did not know you were the one running this program. Marcus glanced briefly toward the photographs displayed across the ballroom, where images of the workshop filled the screens. It started small, he replied. Just a few kids who needed something constructive to do after school. It grew from there. Claire studied his expression carefully. There was no bitterness in his voice. No tension in the way he stood. Just the same steady calm she remembered from years ago when their lives were still moving in the same direction. You built something important, she said quietly. Marcus shook his head gently. The kids built it. I just showed them how to start. The humility in that answer made the silence between them feel heavier than any accusation could have. Claire looked down briefly before speaking again. I have thought about that night more times than I can count. Marcus did not interrupt. He simply waited. She lifted her eyes again and continued, her voice softer now than the confident tone the business world knew so well. I said something careless. Something cruel. I convinced myself it was just a bad moment. But the truth is I did not understand what I was losing. Marcus listened without changing his posture. The ballroom continued its quiet celebration around them while the space between the two of them remained still. Finally he spoke. You did not lose me that night. Claire looked up quickly, a faint flicker of hope crossing her face. Marcus met her eyes with the same calm steadiness he had carried all evening. You lost the man who believed you would always remember, who stood beside you before the world started applauding. The words were not harsh. They were spoken with the quiet honesty of someone who had already made peace with the past. Claire felt the meaning settle slowly in her chest. Across the ballroom the charity host began thanking guests again as the evening prepared to close. Marcus glanced briefly toward the stage before returning his attention to Claire. I am glad you came tonight, he said kindly. The program can always use more support. Claire nodded, understanding the difference in his words. He was speaking as one professional to another now, not as the partner who once shared her life. And in that quiet moment, she realized that some apologies arrive long after the door they are meant to open has already closed. The final guests began leaving the ballroom just after 10 o'clock, their voices fading into the quiet corridors of the hotel, while staff members cleared glasses and folded table linens beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers. Outside the tall windows, the Chicago River reflected the city lights like ribbons of gold stretching through the dark. Marcus Reed stepped away from the last group of volunteers and walked toward the exit with the calm, unhurried pace that had become part of who he was. Nights like this always felt a little strange to him. People thanked him for his work, praised the program, shook his hand with admiration. Yet Marcus never believed the attention belonged to him. It belonged to the children who discovered they were capable of building something with their own hands. Near the entrance, he paused to thank the charity host once more before stepping into the cool evening air. The city greeted him with the steady hum of traffic and the distant sound of a train moving somewhere across the river. A black sedan waited at the curb where several guests were collecting their coats. Marcus slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and looked up briefly at the skyline stretching above the street. 3 years earlier, he had walked out of a restaurant into a night that felt uncertain and quiet. Now he stood beneath the same city lights with a different kind of peace. Behind him, the hotel doors opened again. Claire Whitmore stepped outside and stopped when she saw him standing near the curb. For a moment, she simply watched him the way someone studies a horizon they once traveled but can never return to. Marcus turned slightly when he heard the door close. Their eyes met one last time beneath the soft glow of the street lamps. Neither of them seemed surprised by the silence that followed. Claire finally spoke, her voice gentle in the night air. You built a good life, Marcus. He gave a small nod. I built a meaningful one. The difference between those two sentences settled quietly between them. Claire glanced toward the river where the lights moved across the water like distant reflections of choices long past. Elijah must be proud of you, she said. Marcus smiled softly at the mention of his son. He keeps me honest. A faint breeze moved along the sidewalk, carrying the cool scent of autumn through the street. Claire folded her coat slightly closer around herself. I used to think success meant being admired by rooms like the one we just left, she said quietly. Marcus listened without interrupting. She continued after a moment. Tonight, I realized admiration is not the same as respect. Marcus studied her expression for a brief moment before answering. Respect usually grows slower, but it lasts longer. A car pulled to the curb behind them, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The driver stepped out to open the rear door for Claire. She hesitated before walking toward it. "I am glad you found your path," she said. Marcus nodded once more. Everyone eventually finds the road they are meant to walk. Claire gave a faint smile that carried both gratitude and understanding. Then she stepped into the car, and the door closed gently behind her. The sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the flow of city traffic. Marcus remained on the sidewalk for a moment longer, watching the river lights ripple against the dark water. Some stories do not end with grand reunions or dramatic speeches. They end with quiet understanding. Because sometimes the greatest lesson life offers is not about what we gain. It is about recognizing the value of what once stood beside us before the world became loud enough to drown it out.